All right, so the demographic transition model, probably the most important or one of the most important tools you'll have in AP Human Geography, because we can apply this model to all the countries, right, that we study and how populations change, because it seems like everyone goes through this. So the demographic transition model is separated into 5 stages. What you have to know by the end of this is what each stage is like, what caused each stage to happen, the characteristics of the stage, example countries of each stage, and then how those countries can continue to progress through the demographic transition model. So let's explore it. The first stage, low growth. Now, the first stage of the demographic transition model, if you look at the chart, has a very high birth and death rate. But because they have such a high birth and death rate, where it almost seems that the people who are being born are not living a long time and dying, causes a very low population total. They can't keep or have growth enough to establish a large population. Now, here's a couple reasons why. Well, first off, no country is currently in the first stage of the demographic transition model, and the demographic transition starts with the first agricultural revolution, the Neolithic revolution. That's when we went from hunting and gathering, running around trying to find our food, to staying in one place and throwing our food into the ground and expecting it to be grown. The issue is we haven't perfected farming. We just started it. So while this is perfect to start civilization and have more food and be able to store food, we're still very bad at farming. So it's unpredictable farm yields. We don't know how much we're getting, so people are going to starve. And then on top of that, we still lack medicine. We lack basic hygiene rules. So we still have these high deaths from infectious diseases that now we can fight, from starvation. So overall, we're just keeping NIR low. But remember, no one's in this first stage anymore. So then we get to stage 2. Now, stage 2, incredible. I mean, the whole thing's important, but this is known, stage 2 is the high growth stage, or the population explosion. So what causes the population to just absolutely explode? If you notice, the birth rate on the chart is still very high. It's still in the same place as stage 1, but now the death rate has started to drop. And because we have that gap between the birth and the death rate, we see an exponential jump in our NIR percentage, and that total population just starts to ramp up. Now, what causes this? So for Europe and North America, it's the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s. We have this switch now to factory life. We have basic hygiene. We have sewers and stuff like that. So now people are starting to live longer. We have more access to steady food being grown and stored. So now not as many people are dying to starvation, and now people are living longer. Whereas the continent of Africa, Asia, and Latin America enter stage 2 almost 200 years later. It's very important to understand that the rest of the world goes to stage 2 200 years after North America and Europe. And the reason why the other 3 continents mentioned go to stage 2 around 1950 is because of the medical revolution, because of improved medicine. And we're going to talk about that more in the next stage. But it's imperative to understand why part of the world went to stage 2, and then the other part of the world went to stage 2 200 years later. Some places are currently in stage 2, Sub-Saharan Africa, Yemen, Afghanistan, and one of the most notable things from stage 2 is the Black Plague, right? We still don't have modern medicine, so we are still dying to things that are preventable. Okay, now we get into stage 3, and this is where we start to see moderate growth, right? Notice, look at the chart before looking at anything else. The birth rates are starting to drop. The death rates are still dropping, but by the end of stage 3, the death rates start to level off, and we're still seeing an increase in that total population line, but it's starting to get a little less, right? That NIR percentage is starting to drop because those birth rates are starting to meet those death rates. Still a gap, though, so we're still seeing positive growth in total population. So most European countries and North America transitioned to stage 3 with the medical revolution. Yeah, that thing I just mentioned, right? So the medical revolution originates from North America and Europe. This is, vaccines. This is understanding bacteria. This is creating medicines to cure preventable diseases, right? So the medical revolution drops that death rate even more. That medical revolution is then diffused to the rest of the world through expansion diffusion, and they move to stage 2. But it's not all medicine that causes this, because if it was just medicine and people living longer, the death rates would have dropped, but the birth rates would have stayed high. So this is where we have seen the culture change behind having kids, right? We now don't want or see a need for large families. We don't have to have them. And this is where our high developing nations are. Places like Colombia, India, Jamaica, Kenya, Mexico, South Africa. There's plenty of countries that are in stage 3, right? Where we are transitioning away culturally, socially, that we don't need these large families. And it may be too that, there may be economic factors that people don't have farms. They don't need kids. Kids are no longer an economic asset. They're an economic burden. They cost money now to have kids. Having kids is a choice because you want to, right? That's what we start to see in stage 3. So now stage 4, the low growth. So before looking at any of the notes, let's take a look at our chart. We see that the birth rate has basically met the death rate, and the death rate has stabilized at this point. It is because we are at the point in history where we have basically maxed out where we can get people to live. Now, there are scientific possibilities for us to live longer, but we know that our age really does start to cap out on us. And we have done everything we can to make sure that people live as long as possible at this point. So what causes stage 4 to happen? So countries reach stage 4, and it's not some event. It's when their crude birth rate meets that crude death rate and you get that zero population growth, right? You have as many people leaving the game as there are entering the game. Now, I mentioned in the previous video that 2.1 TFR, right? That fertility rate known as replacement rate. That is the goal for developed nations, right? They want that 2.1 fertility rate so bad, because if you're above that, that means you have population increase. But if you have below that, you could potentially have population decrease, which can be very dangerous for our country. And we're going to explore that topic more. Now, what gets these countries to have that crude birth rate so low, to have that zero population growth, to have that 2.1 total fertility rate? And it all comes back to women, right? Women's roles, the gender roles in society. When women are more educated, they get more opportunities. There's more education about contraceptives and more access to them. And this idea of family planning. These are all critical things in stage 4 to actually get there, right? This idea that now people are planning how many kids they have. This is a first in history. They don't go, well, we're going to have as many kids because we're hoping that some will survive. It's going, no, we're going to have 2 kids and knowing that they're going to survive because there's access to healthcare, because there's money, because there's development and infrastructure. So now population change no longer happens because of differences in birth and death. They happen because of immigration, people coming from other nations, generally the developing world, where you have high population rates. So, when we talk about population, we really look at there's 2 main problems. In the developing world, you have declining birth rates to the point where we're losing population. And then in the developing world, you have too high of a population growth rate. So we have to deal with both of those respectively. Now, in the developing world, we want to drop those birth rates. And I've really hammered this point home that improving education and healthcare, especially for women, is the number one way of lowering birth rates, right? Besides changing culture, which you can't do, number one way. Second way is providing contraception, or at least education about contraceptive. But it's really hard when you have cultural or religious beliefs that go against them, that are all around the world. So while people are trying to push these ideas and this education to drop, population growth rates and understanding why for resource management or for the economic health of your country, the fact is that it is really hard to break culture. I really want to hammer that home, that changing people's cultural perceptions is very, very difficult, no matter how much good it could be for the country. So is it a good thing to lower population growth? That's something we have to ask ourselves. And yeah, depending where it is, right? And that's a very dangerous thing, because people say, oh, we're so populated, we need people to have less kids. Well, depends where, right? Because in MDCs, that's not the case. In the developed world, we actually need people to have kids. And we're going to explore that topic more in the future. So finally, we get to this stage 5, this negative growth. Now, stage 5 is not an official stage of the demographic transition model. But if you look at the chart, we get a lot of questions because stage 5 is where the birth rate actually drops below the death rate. That's where that total fertility rate is now below 2.1. You're not having as many kids who are entering the game as there are leaving, and we see a declining population. And now some people go, well, that's what we want. The world's overpopulated. But that's not a good thing in the developed world. And as I mentioned, we're going to talk a lot about this topic, but when your country runs on a certain number of people and they need the certain amount of people in their economy contributing to that economy, to paying taxes, well, when you lose those people, if you don't replace them with people, who's going to do those jobs and roles in that country? You're either going to automate it or you need to figure something out. And a lot of developed countries are now experiencing this problem, and how to fix it is something we will also talk a lot about. So what stage are we in? If your country is experiencing population explosion, if you have so much growth, you're in stage 2. If we're experiencing zero population growth, then we're in stage 4. Or I'm sorry, yeah, we're in stage 4. But if people are starting to use family planning, we're in stages 3 and 4. These are ways that I didn't even realize they weren't in front of you. So these are things we have to think about, these small characteristics of each stage, because this could be presented to you on an FRQ, this could be presented to you on a multiple choice test, and you have to be able to take these characteristics, identify them to what stage of the demographic transition model they're in, and maybe even take it further and talk about how they could transition further in the demographic transition model, or talk about possibly the struggles of that country or region based on what stage they're in. So I know, super overwhelming, but this is what the entire demographic transition model looks like. It has examples. It has a quick description of the birth rate, death rate, natural increase rate. It has a quick description on why the changes in birth and death rate. Very, very handy chart to have. Finally, we get to the epidemiological transition. So while the demographic transition model talks about how populations change, the epidemiologic transition uses the same 5 stages, but it just adds what causes death in each stage. Like, what is the reason for people dying in each one? Because that's just as important as what changes our population. So the epidemiological transition uses the same model as the demographic transition model. And we're going to follow that death rate, that black line through it. But now we're just labeling what causes that death rate in each of the stages. So stages 1 and 2, we primarily died from infectious and parasitic diseases, the Black Plague, pandemics that we couldn't control or had no idea or didn't understand science. In stages 3, we died from infectious diseases still, even though we start to discover modern medicine. And what really gets us is cardiovascular diseases and cancer, because now we have created basic medicine. So we're living into our 60s and our 70s, and we're starting to realize, like, wait a second, our diets and our lifestyle choices are preventing us from living longer lives. So when you get to stage 4, not only do you have the medicine, but now we have knowledge that, like, alcohol and tobacco are bad for us. We have people exercising. We know how to remove cancers. We can, change organs out of a body. And now we are pushing life expectancy even further. Well, I mean, we're seeing people live into their 80s, their 90s, their 100s, and some are even predicting that the current generations, if they have a healthy lifestyle, can live over 100, and that will be a typical thing. So what about stage 5? Because stage 5 was in the demographic transition model. So is there a stage 5 for the epidemiological transition? And of course there is. What's causing, death rates, possibly what could cause death rates to go up, what could cause, what's pushing these birth rates down related to death. So it is a debated topic, how these will work. But one of these things is, first off, evolution. Diseases alter and change over time. As we constantly fight to eliminate infectious diseases and bacteria, some of that bacteria survives and reproduces. And eventually we could see the birth of supergerms. Poverty is also another reason we could see eradicated or nearly eradicated diseases come back. The fact is that people can't pay for medicine or have that access to the medicine. Like, the medicine is all around the world, it's everywhere. But if you don't have access to it, it could potentially spread those things. One example is tuberculosis, polio, we've tried eradicating from the world. But when you don't have the access to those medicines, these diseases still exist. And of course, what could perpetuate it, and what we seem to be living right now as a real example, is that because of our improved travel, because of globalization, because of our interconnectedness, it is actually detrimental for us when it comes to diseases, because we can rapidly spread it throughout the world. But we have seen the results of that during this fantastic year. And then finally, we have to talk about the AIDS epidemic, because this is one that has affected sub-Saharan Africa, all the countries throughout sub-Saharan Africa, so much that it's possible to send countries back. Their death rates could rise so exponentially that it could look like stage 1 of the demographic transition model, right? And normally countries would not go backwards. You can't go backwards. But because of this terrible disease, we could actually see it happen. So what do you need to know today? Yeah, literally everything about the demographic transition model. I cannot state enough how important it is to understand the demographic transition model, because it's something that can be referenced all the time. Understand each stage and how different regions got into those stages. Know the population characteristics of each stage, those birth, death rates, and the total population. Know examples for each stage of the demographic transition model. Understand how countries move through that demographic transition model. And then finally, connect the demographic transition model to stages of development. You know, like what countries are, LDCs, what stages are they in? High developing countries, what are they in? Developed countries, what are they in? And then finally, just understand the epidemiological transition and basically what kills us in each stage. So, as always, I know this was a long one, 16 minutes, and I talked fast. So if you have to go back and listen to it again, I highly recommend it, because this is probably one of the more important things in AP Human Geography. So go ahead and smash that like button for me. Leave a comment if you're confused, and make sure you subscribe so you're updated when new videos release. As always, this is Bear's Guide to a 5, and I'll see you next time.